Hi, at what point does a sound become music? Where does the boundary of music lie? Does a piano need to have its keys pressed to make music, or can the sound of it burning be considered a song? Does a human even need to be the one to make it? Can the sound of a mere cicada singing in the forest be considered a song? This is the case for experimental music. Calling experimental music a genre can be misleading. Rather, it's more appropriate to call it an approach. The New Grove Dictionary of American Music defined it as a tradition of 20th century musical practice, the fundamental characteristic of which is a continuing search for radically new modes of composition, music making, and musical understanding. Its definition may not be as concrete as other approaches or genres of music, but the NGA does outline experimental music's most important aspects. That it is constantly experimenting and finding new ways to create music, be it through composition, instruments, ideology, action, or environment. Essentially, if there's an aspect of the music making process which can be messed with, rest assured it will be messed with. As the NGA says, this is in contrast to conventional contemporary music, which may not be as bold and eccentric as its experimental counterparts. Experimental music can manifest itself in any genre you can think of, as musicians of all stripes and backgrounds has always had the urge to experiment in some form or another. Really though, just like contemporary art, modern forms of experimental music can trace its roots to art movements from the early 20th century. In a ravaged post-World War I Europe, artists across the continent were pushing the boundaries of what we call art and beauty. Italy's futurists created art which looked towards an ideal future, one filled with speed, dynamism, violence, and rapid technological advancements. And their music reflected it. Futurist composer Luigi Russolo wrote the seminal Futurist music manifesto, The Art of Noises, which argued that because the human ear has been accustomed to the sounds of industry and the hustle and bustle of the city, music too should reflect the energy of everyday life. To create his visions, he crafted instruments called intonarumori, which created sounds resembling industry machinery and the general noise pollution of a city, precursors to the various industrial and noise acts later into the century. Dada, the art movement which questioned the very meaning of art and stripped it bare of its pomp and embracing nonsense, irrationality, and chance, too experimented with music. The likes of Eric Satie and Igor Stravinsky took inspiration from Dada's aesthetics and incorporated its radical playfulness into their compositions, sometimes even writing music for Dada conventions. And so too did Dada poet Hugo Ball, creating sound poems made out of gibberish to highlight the similarities of intelligible sounds and nonsense. But once World War II came crashing into Europe and left yet another horrific scar onto the continent, many pre-World War II art movements had emigrated to North America by then, and it was game-changing. Particularly in New York, where an entire generation of artists took influence from many pre-World War II movements and channeled it in their works. This New York school of art included paintings, poetry, dance, and of course, music. This group included heavy hitters like John Cage, Christian Wolff, Earl Brown, and Morton Feldman. Taking influence from Dada's childlike improvisation, the futurists' embrace of noise, and the surrealists' love for the abstract, they transformed the way future composers approached music. But as the century went on and America's rock and roll started gaining more and more influence on the global zeitgeist, the kids would walk away from the European-centric ideas of the New York school and embrace something completely new. Those kids will come up later. Through the 60s, it was the jazz cats which defined experimental music. The likes of Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, and John Coltrane, who mixed jazz's improvisation with the atonality and noise of the New York school. Free jazz would eventually become free improvisation and influence an entire generation of experimenters. I wonder who has a video all about free jazz and its influence. Oh right, me. But throughout the 60s, there too was the fluxus movement, which saw composers like Ben Patterson and Yoko Ono craft pieces resembling simple instructions which anyone of any skill could do. And the resulting pieces always teetered the boundaries of inane noise and music. Musicians like power electronic pioneers Whitehouse would further these fluxus ideas into their own twisted compositions. And come the 70s, it was the youths, with punk rock which defined the era's experimental scene. This was unlike its predecessors. In came gangs of punks who rejected European composing influences and gravitated to the likes of Chuck Berry and the plethora of noisy Merseyside beat bands. Mixed with America's imperialist wars, the UK failing its own people, and the general discontent and malaise of the youth, you have the perfect recipe for a bunch of punks making really loud, abrasive, and anti-establishment music. Although tame by today's standards, the likes of Wire, Joy Division, and Patti Smith made a lot of noise. This eventually made way to the highly influential no wave. No wave wasn't very popular during its heyday, but as the decade goes on, its influence cannot be understated. Fusing the sounds of punk rock, free jazz, disco, and noise, it was unlike anything which existed before it. It had the simplicity of Dada, the noise of the futurist, the rhythms of disco and funk, and the general fuck you attitude of punk rock. No wave would go on to produce the likes of Swans and Sonic Youth, who in turn would influence generations of noise rockers into the 90s till today. And let's not forget the IDM revolution of the 90s, which fused early 20th century experimentation with the neo sounds of electronica which burgeoned in the 80s. As the new millennium came in with the internet taking over our lives, there has been so much experimental music. This brief history is barely scratching the surface of how experimental music evolved through the 20th century, only focusing on America and Europe. There are still numerous amounts of artists and movements across the world who are pushing the boundaries. If there's one takeaway from the history lesson, it's that experimental music cannot be pigeonholed into a single genre. This is not a genre, but an approach. Nay, a mindset. When conventional approaches to music making is insufficient in expressing yourself and ideas, we turn to experimentation. How do we show pure primal emotion in music? Yoko Ono posits we should shout and scream our hearts out. How do we depict the chaos and filth of the world? Throbbing Gristle in the No Wavers suggests we peel music back to its absolute limits and create noise. How do we show the deconstruction of music? Anea Lockwood says to burn an upright piano, and in the process, it deepens our understanding and perception of what music is. Because what is music if not a bunch of waves vibrating gas, liquids, and solids? The fundamental difference between the sound of a guitar strumming and a police siren is not too far apart. There's a reason why dictionaries attempting to narrow down the description of music is very abstract and generally falls flat. Take for example the Cambridge Dictionary's attempt, describing it as a pattern of sounds made by musical instruments, voices, or computers, or a combination of these, intended to give pleasure to people listening to it. This forgets albums like Broken Hearted Dragonflies, a record by producer Tucker Martin, an album which is solely comprised of sounds from insects in a forest where he presents the sounds they create as something truly alien. Also, what is pleasurable? Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, and pleasure is in the ears of the listener in the case of music. The abstract electronics of Mika Vainio is pleasurable to me, but may not be to many others. The definition of music is impossible to pin down, and it's best that it never is, because it would make the art form very boring. It's thanks to the works of the New York School, noise musicians, no wavers, electronic pioneers, and a whole host of musicians through history who have challenged what music is why the 90s till today have become accepting of abrasive and avant-garde sounds. The influence of experimental music is everywhere, from the mainstream to the indie and underground. Death Grips and JPEG Mafia's blends of noisy, off-the-wall samples is part of a long history of experimenters. Nine Inch Nails got mainstream attention while sticking to their industrial roots, and so too did Nirvana, refusing to back away from their noise rock origins. The IDM of many on the Warp label until today, with the likes of Nicholas Jarre, traces its DNA to the Italian futurist Luigi Russolo's radical compositions. The history of experimental music too has made us accepting of the more comedic side of music, helping a new generation of artists not take it too seriously and have some fun. Remember, although modern experimental music sees its roots start from the trauma of World War I, art is here to express our emotions. It may be of trauma, depression, and anger, or sometimes just plain whimsy. Dadaist compositions tended to have fun with their childlike approach to art, and in turn helped liberate many would-be experimenters in the mid to late 20th century like Captain Beefheart. Perhaps this is why Uno Miles isn't all too insane for us modern listeners. Although he isn't intentionally being experimental, you can't help but see the traces of Hugo Ball's sound poems and Dada in the way he raps. And when John Oswald angered record labels with his cheeky Plunderphonics records, it laid the groundwork for the numerous parody music mashups which has littered the internet and gave Neil Cicierega a career. Experimental music comes in all forms, from ripping up pieces of paper, creating walls of noise with your guitar, putting nuts and bolts in your piano, sampling pre-existing music and twisting it to your vision, or just saying gibberish. It may not be crowd-pleasing, but it was never meant to do so. This approach in music making was created to liberate, to allow artists to question everything about music. What's the proper way to play piano? Why is a police siren not considered music when a trumpet making a similar sound is? Why does a song need legible lyrics when it's just noise? What's the use of rules in music? So, burn your pianos, play some harsh noise, shout some gibberish, and mess around on the cheap Casio keyboard. Because even if you aren't intentionally being experimental, there's nothing more fun than screwing around and making noise. And that's that. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do leave a like and subscribe, or don't, I can't force you. If you want to support the channel, I have a Ko-fi page where you can donate, and I have a second channel where I upload music mixes, so if you want to hear what I've been listening to, you can subscribe to it. I also have a Instagram, so if you want to keep up with whatever I'm doing, you can follow me there. So yeah, I'll see you all around.